Yesterday, Justice Michael Massengale, the First Court of Appeals down in Houston, announced that he is running for Supreme Court of Texas, Place 3. And today we visit with Justice Michael Massengale. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Chad. Thanks for having me on this morning.
Absolutely. Appreciate you giving us a call today. You announced yesterday that you would be running for the Texas Supreme Court, Place 3, against the incumbent who is in that position. And first, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you decided to run.
Sure. I'm from a Texas family. My roots go back to the 1800s here in Texas, and my dad was a career Air Force officer, so I grew up in a military family, moving around. We had your traditional military family values, strong patriotism, hard work, meritocracy. That's my upbringing. I went off to college. Well, I went to high school in Fort Worth, and then went to college at Dartmouth College, came straight back and did law school at the University of Texas in Austin. And then I started my legal practice. I came to Houston, and my first job was working as a law clerk for the Federal Court of Appeals here in Houston. Did that for 2 years, and then I went into private practice with a large firm.
And yesterday you made your announcement that you would run for Texas Supreme Court. And this is one of those, and I bring this up every time I have a judicial candidate on, and candidates who run for Texas Supreme Court. It's one of those elections that, admittedly, a lot of Texans probably don't pay attention to, at least not as much as you probably would want them to. And you're running against an incumbent, which is always tough. Why did you decide to run, and how do you convince Texans to pay attention to this campaign?
Well, Chad, I think you've put your finger on something that concerns all of us as judges. We want to communicate with the voters, but it's sometimes hard to connect with people. What we do know is that voters in Texas have repeatedly shown their preference to have conservative judges at the court. We know that Texans want judges who will be faithful to the laws that are enacted by our legislature, the people we elect and send to Austin, and they don't want judges rewriting the laws, shaping the laws, imposing their own views, and legislating from the bench. And that's why I got into this race, to give voters a choice for a conservative judge on the Supreme Court in this spot.
Yeah, I'm reading your announcement, and the first thing that you say is that, quote, Texans deserve the option to elect a Supreme Court justice who is truly committed to the conservative legal philosophy of carefully and fairly applying laws as they are written and not legislating from the bench. Is there a recent case that you take a look that you look at and say, okay, they did not apply a conservative legal philosophy, and especially when you take a look at the person you're running against, is there a case where you take exception to how they ruled?
Well, let me just pick an example that's not out of the Texas courts and something your viewers are going to be familiar with. I think a lot of people were disappointed with the reasoning used by Chief Justice John Roberts in the Obamacare case, because his reasoning that ultimately supported the constitutionality of the law was to say that the law was a tax. And everybody who paid attention to the political debates knows that it was not sold to the American people as a tax. Our representatives in Congress did not enact it as a tax. And if it had been called a tax, it never would have passed. And so that is one example of how conservative theorists would look at that opinion and say, first of all, he changed what the legislature did to reach a result. He called it a tax in order to affirm it. But then another thing that conservatives have criticized that opinion for is being overly deferential and not doing the judge's job of enforcing a constitutional rule. And so that's an interesting opinion because it can be criticized on a couple of fronts.
And anything on the statewide level?
Well, yes. In particular, we see frequent debates on the Texas Supreme Court about the proper way to interpret a statute. And the conservatives on the court are generally very committed to a principle of textualism, the idea that when we're interpreting a statute, we begin with the words that the legislature actually voted on, and preferably that's where we end, with the words themselves. And some people on the court, and most significantly my opponent in the election, are inclined to use a different approach, and they'll go and pick a statement that a legislator made on the floor or a committee report that was generated, and they'll look to those kinds of other authorities to try to say what the law means, and that's problematic because it turns into a way for judges to change what was actually written in the law and bend it to something that they would prefer to see the rule.
We're visiting with Justice Michael Massengale, candidate for Texas Supreme Court, Place 3. Folks can visit your website, michaelmassengale.com, for more information, and I'm sure we'll visit with you throughout the election season. But as we let you go, tell folks one thing they really need to know about Justice Michael Massengale.
Well, I think people will be interested to know that I was appointed by Governor Perry 6 years ago, and I've got a record that people can look to, and my opponent has a record as well. And many people who supported my opponent in her last election have seen her record, they know my record, and they've decided to support me, most prominently Texans for Lawsuit Reform, but also other prominent conservatives like George Strake and Kathy Adams and former Texas Supreme Court Justice Scott Brister. So I think when our records are compared, the voters are going to know who the true conservative choice is in this election.
Justice Massengale, appreciate your time this morning. MichaelMassengale.com is your website. We encourage folks to go and check out your information there on the website. Appreciate your time today.
Thanks so much, Chad. Have a great day.
You too. That's Justice Michael Massengale running for Texas Supreme Court, Place 3.